Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Matthew J. Histon, and we're going to be talking about the relevance of history. Hello, Matthew. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Matthew, I love history. I find the deep roots research in economics to be quite fascinating. And recently you published a journal article in one of my favorite journals, the Journal of Institutional Economics. It is titled History and Cultural Evolution, Measuring the Relationship through the Wikipedia Network. Matthew, what motivated this research?
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm really happy to hear that you like reading that journal because I do think that it's even if it's based in economics, it really is kind of a pluralistic approach to a number of different outcomes there. And I share an interest in history like you, and I am also trained as an institutional economist, which
Great.
had led me to kind of examine these sorts of dynamics between basically how much kind of path dependency there is when it comes to history and particularly modern outcomes, of which you often find people are always correlating something from a long time ago that is still having pretty significant effects on what the world looks like today.
Great. So that motivated your research. Path dependency.
Um, Path dependency, among other things. I think I'm interested in a version of economics that really begs the question of how do people cooperate, or how do we scale up cooperation through different kinds of institutions? And
Exactly.
yeah, so I think from there, there's all different kinds of directions you can go to even just unpack this question in more detail, like what is an institution and what are the boundaries between these types of
What I
things.
like about the research on the deep roots of history is that some of the popular arguments are not being replicated. Over politically incorrect arguments are indeed being replicated. So there is an argument that the slave trades underdeveloped Africa. But the research is showing that despite the disadvantages of the slave trades, African populations would have been lower anyway, and Africa would still not be as rich as North America or Western Europe. And when I say Africa, I'm referring to individual countries in Africa and the continent, comparing the continent of Africa to Europe based on wealth. But some of the politically incorrect ideas are being replicated. So I don't know if you are familiar with these recent studies, but Chinese researchers are actually finding that Confucianism had a negative impact on growth in pre-industrial China. And many of the arguments of people like Carlos Cipollo and David Landes are being replicated, like culture is really important. So that's why I find the research so interesting.
Yeah, I'm not quite as familiar with the literature you're speaking to, and of course, it's hard to determine these counterfactuals of what would have and would have not been the
Yes.
case. But it's absolutely the case too that there are costs that come with colonialism, et cetera, that we want to be very
Yes.
cautious about, and not necessarily be willing to trade off any amount of dignity for some
Yeah.
amount of economic gains, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. But I was expecting literature on colonialism to be more negative,
Hmm.
like mind-blowing negative. But so far, the evidence has really been mixed, or what some would describe as rather bland. But back to your research.
Hmm.
I'm going to list the title, or maybe I did that earlier already, but I will just repeat it again. History and Cultural Evolution. Yes, it was already repeated. Wikipedia. Why was Wikipedia chosen? What's the importance of Wikipedia?
Right. So I guess the story of the literature that this is a part of is again kind of referring to this notion of a lot of modern outcomes are bounded by history, and the cultural relatedness component comes into this along the notion of you have diffusions of culture that are then going to affect diffusions of invention and institutions in these kinds of situations. And there's a number of authors who have written about this question about how cultural similarity leads to the potential long run sustained economic growth because it propagates channels of productive economic institutions in different kinds of ways. And the issue, though, is culture is kind of a strange thing to try to pin down. And in general, economists haven't usually liked to talk about the word culture specifically because it's vague, right? And in general, so far as it became more kind of into the mainstream in the past 10 or 20 years or so, a lot of evaluations of culture have focused on things like surveys or experiments. So you'll have somebody who tries to put a circle around something amorphous like individualness or trustfulness or whatever else by looking at things like the world value surveys.
Yes.
And then they might try as well to have people play some kind of economic experiment like a dictator game to, again, determine how much different cultures potentially violates selfishness principles or these types of situations. And I want to emphasize that there's a lot of kind of really interesting things that that studies have shown by doing that, by following along surveys and experiments, whether it's related to parking tickets or blood donations or these types of things that have come out of it. But I want to kind of also draw a couple of issues that I do find with those measures. And so first of all, I think they're kind of fundamentally reductive in the sense that they're really imposing a top-down measure of what culture is by saying, again, this notion of a belief or attitude, or more broadly, whatever we want to characterize culture as, comes down to what your answers are in some kind of lottery game that I have you play. Secondly, the issue is, again, culture is there's a lot of dimensions to culture. And when we have them run different kinds of experiments, it's not so easy to compare across those dimensions of cultures that we begin to characterize. So, for example, again, answers to survey questions don't easily square with other methodologies when I then have you play some sort of game theory type game. So it's really hard to compare those different proxies that we might get. And perhaps most importantly, it's really requiring us to stick to what we've already thought about in terms of what culture is and what we can easily measure. So things like music or cuisine or fashion matter significantly in, again, how cultures cooperate, but are not so easy to potentially measure. So what I wanted to do then is kind of make this argument that if instead we look at something like Wikipedia, in fact, the network structure of Wikipedia, we actually now have a sort of novel dimensional space to try to determine some notions of culture. And by here, culture, we mean how do people cooperate or how do people interact? And of course, I'm sure you know what Wikipedia is, but it's this widely contributed platform aggregating knowledge from many different viewpoints across many different contributors as an open-ended encyclopedia. And by taking kind of advantage of this idiosyncratic dispersed network structure, we can actually start to develop a unit of analysis that asks how different countries might be similar along a lot of emergent dimensions. Okay, so I can take the 6 million articles in Wikipedia and see how two countries kind of relate through all those network intersections that take place across the hyperlinks of these different articles. So I'll pause and give you a moment if you want any clarification.
No, it's okay. You can
Okay.
continue. But before you divulge the research findings, I have another question.
Of
What
course.
is genetic distance?
Sure. So I guess I'm not sure how much you want me to stick specifically to that research paper, if you want to talk more broadly about history, et cetera.
No, you're going to stick to the research paper, but
Mhm.
I read your paper and you
Mhm.
mentioned genetic distance and how that affects the diffusion of technology. So at some point, we're going to talk about genetic distance.
Sure. So the
You can
claim.
be brief. You don't need to
Mm,
respond like a scientist. I have discussed the issue already with other people, but for first time listeners, they might be interested. So just give a one line.
yeah, of course. Well, again, the question that this research is trying to ask is something along the lines of how much is the history constraining current economic prosperity, right? Which
Yeah.
is, again, one of the most important questions in economics. And the story that we're trying to make is there's something about culture and history that are very kind of closely tied to each other. And if we look at today's cultural outcomes, we're trying to say, well, how much of historical outcomes potentially affected those kinds of things, right? So that's the broad structure here. And this sort of historical measure comes from some of these ancestry genealogy data that other scientists have used to basically try to approximate some composition of more or less historical populations. Because what you can do is you can kind of, all humans share the same set of alleles, but they basically appear in different frequencies. So what you can do is you can kind of genetically examine the polymorphic expressions of these types of things to more or less try to have a molecular clock. Sorry, I have some kind of update that shows about how far apart different populations split apart when they last shared a common ancestor. So that gives you some kind of estimation about how close they are historically, which then we can ask questions about how much that affects how close their cultures are today.
Great.
So, so it's been put to these are data that have been put together by different kinds of population scientists that were then kind of picked up by economists and some other social researchers to be able to again kind of draw some sort of estimation, some sort of proxy about historical relatedness. And then a lot of other economists and researchers have then tried to correlate those historical relatedness outcomes with contemporary outcomes, including contemporary cultural relatedness as a kind of estimation of how bound we are to those historical influences. And then the result of my study is trying to say that on the one hand, yes, like I can come up with a new sort of measure of cultural relatedness via Wikipedia, which I can again elaborate on in a moment. That does show that there's a lot of this sort of path dependency that we've spoken about. But also I kind of try to, I think my actual contribution here is showing, well, where does the path dependency actually break down? That is, what kinds of features of informal, formal institutions or culture, as we want to call it, that actually start to break away from the binds of that historical determinism. And in particular from there, I argue about the role of impersonalizing institutions,
Yes.
which again, we can elaborate on in different
Of course,
details.
I
Yeah.
just want you to explain the research and the
Mhm,
methodology. That's why you're here. And
mhm,
in the conclusion, we will explain the link between culture and current outcomes. So how you design or your design of the research is
mhm.
really important. So why was Wikipedia chosen? How were the analyses conducted? You also said that some traits were not historically sensitive,
Mhm,
like business and technology, for example.
mhm.
So you
Right.
should elaborate on all of that.
Right, exactly. So this is all part of this this argument of basically a lot of research has shown where's their historical path dependency, and it's a lot harder to kind of tease out, well, where is that path dependency lessening, right? And that's this concept that we can elaborate on different dimensions. But the story here is that this kind of again network structure of Wikipedia allows for a new way for us to consider cultural relatedness outside of just looking at something like survey questions or experiments. And to kind of point to a couple of the points that I was making earlier, the issues that exist surrounding current empirical measures of culture. Um, when I talk about something like Wikipedia, I'm not actually when I'm talking about actually more precisely like a network statistic over Wikipedia to try to capture culture. What I'm really saying is if I take a country like Japan and I take a country like India, and I think of all the links from their Wikipedia pages, of which there's thousands, right? We're again asking how does that kind of flow through a weighted network to determine how close they are? And on the one hand, Japan might have a link directly to something like baseball. And India might have a link directly to something like cricket, right? These are important dimensions of their culture. And even though they're not the same link, as we sort of continue on through that network, we're going to see that cricket and baseball are actually pretty close. And that's going to then measure one of these cultural dimensions of how these two countries might be in common. Now, again, if we do that across all of the links that they have and do some network analysis of that relatedness, we're now talking about a kind of way to compare these two countries that is not just simply comparing what their differences in answers were on these surveys. And where this starts to get interesting is on the one hand, we're leaving culture broadly defined. So I can talk about their similarity in a number of different categories if I collapse the network, the encyclopedia down into different categories. But on the other hand, I'm just thinking about how do they connect? Okay. So that is, I can include measures related to fashion or cuisine or sports, which have not typically been possible to measure alongside these other values that have kind of come up when we talk about linguistic similarity or religious affiliation, et cetera. So I can replicate some of those previous findings as well as expand into new domains. And because these dimensions of culture become more standardized, that is the network statistic for cultural similarity related to language or Wikipedia articles that are language adjacent is very kind of comparable to a comparison related to Wikipedia articles associated with religion. I can actually compare those statistics. Where again, previously, if I'm trying to measure individualness according to survey answers, and then trustfulness according to an experimental game you play, it's not quite clear that those methodologies can kind of square against each other because they don't have that same level of standardization. And finally, then, I really want to say as well, too, by using Wikipedia, I'm kind of leaving discovery open. That is, I don't necessarily know what kinds of relationships might emerge from these large data. It's not clear to me how Japan and India might be related if I don't just bound it according to a question that I'm asking from this kind of top-down approach. So there's been a number of kind of surprising relationships that have come down to this, where again, if I collapse the encyclopedia to only consider Wikipedia pages related to language, you'll find that a lot of times Arabic is more important than something like French. It ranks higher in these network statistics, which you might not have expected given the influence of French on the English language. But you realize that Arabic has influenced very heavily things like astronomy and mathematics, and that appears in different kinds of weights throughout that entire network. Or again, something if I collapse the network down into just considering inventions, something like the can opener ranks much higher than you would have ever expected because you don't know what kinds of relationships are going to emerge out of these network dynamics. So the story then is we can kind of understand culture in a much more flexible way, and we can also start to compare different versions of culture in a way that's a little bit more systematic because it's all just deriving network statistics over essentially the same source data.
All right. Do you know what I am thinking about presently? I am
Tell
thinking
me what you're
about
thinking about.
Japan.
Sure.
So Steven Sanderson and Alan McFarlane wrote two separate articles on Japan. It appears that there were parallels between Japan and Europe during the pre-industrial era. So I'm not surprised that Japan was the first non-Western country to modernize. So it would be great if you could conduct a study on Japan, decentralization in Japan, or the family structure in Japan. That would be interesting. Or even entrepreneurship in Japan. There are businesses in Japan that are quite ancient.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's something about this network of Wikipedia that could potentially reveal some of the questions that you're talking about, that perhaps there's some principle or philosophy in Japanese culture that was more associated with entrepreneurship than potentially some of these other offshoots of Europe or whatever else. And that's exactly the kind of flexibility that I'm hoping to emphasize by thinking of Wikipedia
Exactly.
as data. Yeah.
So in Japan, there was not an idea of progress akin to the European idea of progress. But even during the Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese kept tabs on other countries, and the Japanese have shown a remarkable ability to learn. They're attuned to new technologies, even though the culture is conservative. So, what are the traits embedded in Japanese culture that promote openness to ideas? I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I think that this considering Wikipedia to try to reveal some of those links that are associated with different, we can call openness more broadly in different kinds of countries. If we could probably back out some unexpected features that might have mattered, right? And very abstract ones too about differences between, I don't know, Taoism and Buddhism and other kinds of effects as well that again might manifest eventually as
Yes.
something you're talking about.
Do you know what has been circulating in the literature on economics, but currently economists have not given it a title? Confucianism was recalibrated to promote economic growth in the postmodern era in China. So during the pre-modern era in China, Confucianism had a negative impact on growth. However, Confucianism prioritized human capital and long-term orientation. Therefore, when China modernized post the 1970s and later, Confucianism became important because the Chinese could draw on that legacy of the appreciation for human capital formation and long-term orientation and savings. Whereas
Mm,
during the pre-modern era, Confucianism promoted conformity and deference to authority. But
right.
in postmodern China, Confucianism has been completely repurposed to promote economic growth. I think that's also
Right,
interesting.
right. Yeah, so this is exactly the kind of characterization of how we want to think about culture as sort of comparative institutional effects here, where in the one case it might improve cooperation, particularly aimed at economic gains and promote discipline and whatever else. But in a different context, it might have actually suppressed innovative thinking
Yes.
or these kinds of situations that can then be correlated with different kinds of outcomes. And just to kind of clarify the way that the methodology that I'm using, particularly in this paper, works, is you would, I don't know, take like a bunch of different cities in China, and you would more or less see like how far away or what are the weighted statistics in their Wikipedia networks towards something like Confucianism. And the story is that in the sense, a lot of economic literature, I'll give you the parallel, has been like, well, how far away you are from Lancashire, England, where the Industrial Revolution started, is a very good predictor of what your industrialization level is today, or how far you are away from wherever Martin Luther originally nailed theses on is kind of a good treatment effect for how Calvinistic you are today, or whatever it is. And we can kind of think of the same thing now occurring in a virtual space where we can pinpoint different articles or even leave them open and say how far you're away from these things is influencing different kinds of outcomes in an equivalent kind of weighting of the cultural treatment effect through the entire network.
Yeah, and I don't like research because it's controversial. I like useful research. And sometimes useful research is controversial. What I do appreciate is that many economists are acquainted with quantitative methods in genetics. And I do believe that genes are the next frontier in economic research because if we're not able to isolate the genetic effects of particular genes, we're only going to beg the question in the long term.
So I think I want
So
to emphasize.
your research is right up that street. I'm pushing you to become more familiar with genetic methods if you're not already familiar with them. But yes, I think
Well,
that's really
I
important.
think I'm trying to make the argument here that there's nothing meaningful about genetic traits. It's
That's
just
what you're
simply a
saying. Well, that's what you
summary.
say
It's just a
no.
summary statistic to describe where people were at different points in time, right? So that's what this research is saying. I'm not, like I think no one in this literature is trying to claim that a particular expression of a gene is represented in these alleles. These alleles are just kind of like random combinations that don't necessarily have realized traits. So when I say we're using these genetic data, it's simply to kind of characterize um, kind of again how historically far apart populations were. Not that there's any realized molecular differences or anything like that between populations.
Okay, but is that being ruled out completely?
Well, I think that my research is totally agnostic. I don't think it
Okay,
has
I
anything
already
to
research,
realize with
so
that
I
whatsoever.
would know.
I beg your pardon. Sorry.
No, I said I read your research, so
Mhm.
so I would know. But I like to push the boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah, I
think
like
there's
explosive
room for
people. I like
controversy,
when
of
research
course.
is explosive.
Yeah, again, I think the way that my understanding of how these genetic data have been used is, once again, just as kind of like a proxy for historical relatedness, just as a
Yeah.
summary statistic for how long certain groups of people have been kind of circled around each other. And the story here is just that if they've been around each other for a long time, they're more likely to share commonalities in institutions, not genetics. So it's more likely that they're going to have similar food
Yes.
tastes or similar clothing styles, and then potentially even higher similar attitudes, similar beliefs, similar folklore, similar political institutions, depending on how long we do want to climb that ladder.
So cultural similarity then. Cultural distance can affect trade and the diffusion of ideas.
Exactly right. And then the story is the more similar culture you have, the more easy it is from some, let's say economic innovation on one adjacent culture to kind of flow over and diffuse into one close by. Where there's more cultural frictions in between them, it's going to be much harder to implement and take much longer. And again, there's lots of other researchers who have kind of pointed that out. Um,
Yes. Do you plan to do research on Africa in the future?
well, again, I would love to because I think that my major contributions in this paper is first of all, kind of trying to proxy for culture using Wikipedia, and secondly, making an argument related to impersonalizing institutions and the theory of modularity. So those are the two things that I think are the main arguments here. And the value of Wikipedia is that you can actually rather cheaply examine a lot of countries because everyone is participating in this apparatus we call Wikipedia. And unfortunately, I've only focused on the English language so far, just because it's my mother tongue and it's a little bit easier for me
Yes.
to analyze. But I can easily use the same network and natural language processing to spill over into other language versions as well, which means that we could um, probably develop really interesting ways to compare language versions of Wikipedia across Africa and try to detect, again, interesting cultural dynamics and relationships that could hopefully shed light on, again, how do we make institutions more effectively diffuse into those areas where there might be cultural distances?
And Wikipedia is the perfect tool because of its scope for language analysis. Language is critical for this type of research because if the evidence is showing, let's say that one culture doesn't have a word for science, that would have long-term implications. So I would love for you to do similar research. So I'm interested in language and linguistics and how words indicate future economic performance. So if a
Yeah, I
culture
think
doesn't have a word for science, what does that say about the particular culture?
I think I agree with you, and I think there can be really interesting relationships that come out of this. Let me again emphasize that it's more future work where I want to do natural language processing because for now
Okay.
I'm just doing the network analysis. But an equivalent example would be something like suppose I take a network cluster of science, right? So I think of
Yeah.
all the science related things in this network, and then I take another one related to, let's say, epistemology or something like that. That is, how do we come to know and verify knowledge? And looking at those kinds of relatedness might very much lead to all the kinds of predictions that you're talking about. So it's not even
Yeah.
just words, it can be entire associations between fields that might have really interesting predictive outcomes where, again, I know some of your previous uh, discussion guests have spoken about relationships between different kinds of values and innovation
Yeah.
again, right? And if we see that there's kind of interesting materialized relationships there, then we can start to beg policy questions about, promoting good relationships and potentially untangling unproductive ones at the same time. So
Yes.
yeah, I think you're,
Yes.
you're
Yes.
definitely identifying how I'm trying to think about using these data.
Yeah. I like to give academics work to do. Your next project could be China. So China is a perfect case study because it's an Asian civilization. Why am I interested in China? I'm interested in China because of the durability of Chinese institutions.
Of course, right.
China is basically an unbroken civilization, and it is a rule by law society, not a rule of law society.
Okay.
And one writer, he argues that the Chinese word for law was basically punishment, and the Chinese they have still followed that model. So I would love to see some form of network analysis measuring
Right.
the ebb and flow of the rule of law in China over time, or the linguistic evolution of the rule of law.
Right. And again, I think that these data can actually start to parcelize a little bit about some of the points that you're making when you say rule of law versus rule by law. Was that the
Yes, yes,
term you
yes.
used? Yeah, we can imagine some cultures have more or some societies have more sort of informal cultural ways to behave. So if you've ever been to Germany, nobody crosses the street when it's not a green
Are
light,
you
even if there's no
German?
cars. No, I'm American,
Oh,
but
but are you
I've
of
I've been
German
there.
descent?
I beg your pardon?
Are you of German descent?
I'm not sure what my ancestry is, but I have spent time in Germany because
Okay,
it's
I
a
would
it's a
love
beautiful
to go to
country.
Germany.
Yeah, but what you'll find is you don't really need to enforce laws because people self-enforce, right? Whereas if you do have to have kind of like a more hierarchical approach to establishing rules to follow, that leads to different consequences. And again, as somebody who's trained in organizational institutional economics, I think the question comes down to sort of like the comparison between those, or more likely the endogeneity and trajectory of those things, where at first you might have to rather rigorously enforce something by law, but then once it becomes a little more adopted culturally, then you can back off a little bit. And I think one thing that I often think about is, economists like to talk about laws and property rights. They like to do that stuff a lot, but I think just so much of our society really depends on not having to enforce a lot of behaviors with a police person, because if every time you had to have somebody have a police officer make sure people turn the water off after washing their hands, that'd be really, really expensive. Whereas if we can have some of these more informal ways to get people to follow and cooperate, that goes back to this notion of what is economics. It's really about scaling cooperation
Okay.
between
And
people.
probably that's why the democratic project has been more successful in the West because Western countries developed impersonal institutions earlier. They also developed self-enforcement mechanism at the community level.
Yeah, and this
Let me
you
give you
bring
a
up
perfect
a
example. A perfect example. So I'm from Jamaica. I was born in Jamaica, lived there until recently. And in Jamaica, when you enter into a supermarket, you place your bag somewhere. You place your bag somewhere, you purchase your goods, then you get your bag. That's the norm in most places in Jamaica. And I've been to other countries where those norms are not enforced because trust is higher. So the expectation is that somebody will enter into the supermarket, purchase his goods, and leave. You will not steal. So
yeah,
doing
it's
business is easier outside of Jamaica. It's
right.
quite
I think
taxing in Jamaica because it's a low trust society and a corrupt society.
right, and this is again going back to this concept in economics called more or less transaction costs, which is how expensive is it to enforce exchange. And there's different ways that we can solve that problem, which kind of go back to the point you're making of tilting towards a more sort of state-based solution or tilting into a more cultural-based one. But even, I'm American now and I live in Los Angeles, but I lived in Stockholm for a while. And I remember that our lease when we lived in Stockholm was about a page long. Whereas here in LA, my lease was about 75 pages long. And I think this also goes to kind of spell out of how much do we have to explicitly characterize what should normalize the kind of relationship we have, and how much do we trust people versus how much do we have to rely on a third party institution.
Yes. The, the literature on transaction costs is interesting, but I think it could be better. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I hope
let me
so.
explain. Let me explain why I'm saying this. The literature on transaction costs is has studied why transaction costs are lower in rich countries, in weird countries, Western,
Mm.
educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. It has not interrogated the failure of institutions to lower transaction costs in poor countries. That's not the norm. That's why I think it ought to be improved.
Yeah, I think you're making a really interesting point here, which is certainly the case that a lot of economic growth um, through has occurred through markets via lowering transaction costs, but on the market side, whereas we haven't considered from a policy perspective quite as carefully how to lower transaction costs on a more again kind of like stranger cooperative
Yes.
basis, right? And yeah, I mean this is again the other kind of components that I try to emphasize in my paper is that there is something really important about this notion of impersonal exchange or anonymized cooperation, or in Douglas North's terminology, open access societies, which is
Yes.
that anyone can enter. It's kind of like trying to characterize how easily can strangers cooperate with each other. And this is a trait that Heinrich emphasizes a lot as well too.
Yes.
That I also try to point to and emphasize in a particular form of theory called towards modularity theory, where the idea is when you can let strangers cooperate, you kind of increase the possibility space of interactions that can take place substantially. And if we think of different notions of how you make that occur, an important one is just standardizing different sorts of social personas such that you know what to expect when you cooperate with somebody, as opposed to having to rely on much more personal-based markers or kinship networks, as again, lots of other authors have argued pretty extensively. So to your points, or I guess to kind of corral your points back into a similar argument that I'm trying to make, or maybe recharacterization of an argument I'm trying to make. It is very much this notion of the role that impersonalized institutions make in lowering transaction costs, such that we can increase the scale of cooperation and ultimately the effects of sustained long-run economic growth. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and would love to think of more careful policy implementation to try to do and get at the point you're making.
Yes. Economic research should be translated into policy outcomes. So if the idea
Yeah,
is good, it ought to be applied to solve a problem. That's why it's called useful knowledge.
yeah. Well, it's hard, and there's a lot of steps between the economist and the potential politician. But really, I think the conclusion of my paper was trying to, on the one hand, make a rather obvious remark, which was that we have to consider carefully culture alongside the policies we implement, because it's certainly been the case that a lot of global Western institutions will go to a country in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa and say, this particular interest rate policy worked in England, so we're going to implement that here. And not understanding the kind of cultural frictions that are actually in between the diffusion of that institution and what might actually work. A perhaps more famous example is you can't just go into Iraq and establish democratic institutions, right? You can't just establish a democratic political legal process if there aren't the norms, value, and cultural kind of attitudes that come along that would kind of presuppose the effectiveness of that outcome. So this notion of trying to think of policy of effective policy alongside the sort of cultural distance and the cultural effectiveness of that policy is something that I definitely want to see more of as opposed to one size fits all research.
Do you have hopes for developing countries? Some of them are going around in circles,
Mm.
like the Latin American region. 1 minute predictions for Latin America are positive. Then 2 seconds later, these predictions are negative.
Yeah. So obviously, I have hope. I think that's it's been one of the great triumphs of the 20th century is to see large improvements in global South countries in reducing poverty. But what I will emphasize, though, especially since we're talking about culture, and culture includes things like attitudes and beliefs. I remember there was a great line in one of Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi's book about what it is to be in a let's say, global South country, is that there is the prospect of progress. There is the belief and that you're on an upward trajectory and that things are getting better. And I think that's something really, really important to consider where, again, being American, where there's such a kind of cynicism about progress, is that those attitudes become self-fulfilling. And the likeliness of people to
Repeat the name of
engage.
the book. Repeat the name of the book.
Um, I will give you it afterwards. I think I'm referencing her book.
Oh, the Nigerian writer. Okay.
Yeah, it's a novel. So I'm
Oh yeah,
thinking
I
I think
know.
it's
She's a fiction. Yeah,
Americana.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's her.
Yeah, but really I think this I know you've interviewed Deidre McCluskey before, and
Yes.
I really appreciate her work where I almost can, I'm sorry for putting words in her mouth, but I would say something like, what is capitalism? Capitalism is a tolerance to change. Capitalism is an excitement for change and acting on entrepreneurial opportunities. And if you're kind of suppressing about what the hopefulness of that future looks like, in a sense, you're suppressing what those entrepreneurial outcomes will realize. And when I talk about global South countries, I think that they really have internalized an attitude of excitement and entrepreneurial outcomes. And I think that cultural dimension is there. I think this other thing that we would hope to see improve is the kind of institutional apparatus to then support those entrepreneurial outcomes. So I think it's this kind of mix of culture and institution, but at the very least, I think the culture is there, the
Okay.
excitement is there. But I think that, to your point, some of these other aspects of potentially impersonalizing relationships in a way
All
to
right.
reduce
Okay.
transaction costs a
So
little bit would be
we're
valuable.
wrapping up now. Speaking to you has been a pleasure, and thanks for coming on. Coming on. We have like 2 seconds left, so that's why I have to wrap up. But yes, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I
Yeah, it's a
want to have
pleasure.
you on again at some point. Bye.
Yeah, and we can brainstorm more about
Of
possibilities of
course,
using these
I'll
data
send you some
sets.
emails.
Please
All
do.
right.
All right.
With
Good
the
luck. It's a
Chinese
pleasure
studies, I'm
talking
going
with
to
you.
send you the studies on Confucianism.
Yeah,
Bye.
that'd be great. Very
All
well.
right.